and welcome to this WION Live Broadcast from Washington, D.C. I'm Kate Fisher, and in this bulletin we'll bring you all the latest updates on the United Nations General Assembly, as well as the other stories that are developing around the world. First up, let's take a look at the headlines. An action-packed week at the UNGA is on. The United Nations General Assembly debate kicks off. US President Joe Biden will be addressing it shortly. French President Emmanuel Macron speaks to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and discusses issues related to the Indo-Pacific region. This as France deals with the fallout from Australia's cancellation of a $40 billion submarine order with France, and says it will be difficult to rebuild trust.
You are sending us back to work with a clear mandate to get Canada through this pandemic and to the brighter days ahead.
Liberal Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau returns to power in a hotly contested election, but preliminary results suggest Trudeau fails to gain an absolute majority. Sudan's fragile transitional government says it foiled an attempted coup involving military officers and civilians linked to the ousted regime of longtime President Omar al-Bashir. The United Nations voices deep concern at mass US deportations of Haitian migrants, warning that people with serious asylum claims may be at risk as the US moves around 4,000 Haitians from under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas. Our top story, US President Joe Biden will address the United Nations General Assembly in just a few minutes from now. At the summit, President Biden will push back against the idea that the United States is plunging into a new Cold War with key rivals, including China and Russia. Reports suggest that Biden will instead stress diplomacy and vigorous competition in his speech at the annual UN summit. A senior White House official told the AFP news agency, quote, President Biden will communicate that he does not believe in the notion of a new Cold War with the world divided into blocs. He believes in vigorous, intensive, principled competition. The president will essentially drive home the message that ending the war in Afghanistan closed the chapter focused on war and opens a new chapter focused on personal, purposeful, effective American diplomacy. End quote. This was later confirmed by the White House press secretary.
We'll make absolutely clear that he is not looking to pursue a new Cold War with any country in the world. We will continue to pursue our interests. We will continue to lift up global priorities, but that is not the objective or the policy of the United States.
In his first address to the United Nations as US President, Joe Biden will stress that Washington will work with allies and partners to solve problems that can't be solved by military force. Ahead of his first speech as president at the UNGA, US President Joe Biden also met with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres in New York. Biden said a strong partnership with the UN was more important now than ever, and that no one country can solve key problems alone.
Freedom and human dignity on which the UN was founded. I went back and reread the charter. I remember we sometimes forget what the founding principles were, not you, we, the world. Every UN member state likewise has an obligation to uphold those fundamental commitments and that we've all made. And normally the task is already ahead for each one of us, and it's real.
Following his UNGA address, President Biden will meet Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison in New York before returning to Washington to meet British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. So a busy day. Remember, the UNGA takes place less than a month after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which ended a 20-year war. The speech gives Joe Biden his biggest opportunity yet to talk about the direction of US foreign policy. Following criticism at home and abroad that the US troop withdrawal from Afghanistan in August was chaotic and poorly planned, leaving behind some US citizens and Afghan allies who could face reprisals from the Taliban. It will be a challenging week for US President Biden that will be dominated by foreign policy amid questions about his handling of the US pullout from Afghanistan. He's also likely to face questions on a nuclear submarine deal with Australia that has angered France. President Biden will also host the first in-person summit of the leaders of the Quad Group, which will be attended by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Australian PM Scott Morrison, and the Japanese leader, Prime Minister Suga. At the UNGA, President Biden will also issue an all-hands-on-deck call for global cooperation to end the COVID-19 pandemic that has ravaged the world since early 2020. President Biden will also highlight the US's commitments on climate change. Well, for more on all of this, let's go across now live to WION's principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sabal, who is live for us from Washington, D.C. Siddhant, hello.
Hello. In Washington, of course, the focus will be on the Quad and, of course, the in-person bilateral between the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the US President Joe Biden. But nonetheless, it will be essentially the nerve center of Indian Prime Minister's visit to United States. He, of course, was in US in 2019. That was his last visit. But this visit comes very early on in the Biden administration, just 7 months into the Biden administration, that the Indian Prime Minister is here and, of course, will be part of the Quad as well. But as the Indian Foreign Secretary outlined earlier today in Delhi about the key focus area for Quad, how it is a diplomatic initiative, and the shadow of AUKUS is something that is being talked about. In fact, when it comes to AUKUS, will it have any impact on Quad is the big question. As of now, it is unlikely, given the fact that as the Australian envoy in Delhi said, that it is enhancing the capabilities of one of the Quad member country, that is Australia. But there can be a big blow to the trilateral between France, India and Australia. The trilateral has made significant progress so far. In fact, the leaders of the trilateral are expected to meet next month on the sidelines of the G20 in Italy. But it looks that this would not be possible now, given the tiff between the French and the Australians.
So do you think, Siddhant, the US has obviously assured India that the AUKUS pact won't detract from either bilateral cooperation with New Delhi or the multilateral cooperations like the Quad Group? Will AUKUS be part of the Modi-Biden discussions? How will that go?
Well, when it comes to President Biden and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's discussion, it will be about terrorism, counter-terrorism. Afghanistan undoubtedly will be the big focus area. We know Afghanistan has been talk of the conversations at various meetings, whether it's SCO, whether it's the BRICS meetings, and this bilateral meeting and Quad as well. But we know that India-US relationship, this is a partnership that has seen progress in various sectors, whether it's defense, whether it's people-to-people relationship, or space, or any other sector you may talk about. And largely, if we talk about AUKUS, when it comes to this bilateral engagement, the Indian Defense Minister and the US Secretary of Defense had spoken to each other on Monday, and this conversation as the readout stated, was on Afghanistan, but it has been now confirmed that there were references to AUKUS as well, assurances from the American side. But it is the Australian side that really kept the Indian side in loop regarding the AUKUS, in terms of the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison speaking to the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, the Foreign Minister and the Defence Minister of Australia speaking to their Indian counterparts just hours before the AUKUS was formally announced. That shows that how the Australian side was keen to engage and keen to make sure that there are no surprises, as we know that in diplomacy surprises are something that can be in a sense impacting the relationship, as is the case when it comes to France-US relationship.
Sidhan Sabal, thank you so much. We can now cross live to the UN headquarters in New York and to our reporter, Suzanne Tarani. Susan, what can we expect from Joe Biden's maiden speech as US President at the United Nations General Assembly?
We actually just saw the president, his motorcade, enter the United Nations premise just a few minutes ago, and he's going to be taking the stage as U.S. president for the first time. And really, it's at a time when his international credibility is in question, and he's said, you know, that he wants to focus on intense diplomacy. That's the message that's been coming out from the White House. With his allies, he's stressed on vigorous competition, noting that vigorous competition does not mean going back to a Cold War era and a Cold War mentality, pointing to competition with countries like Russia and China. But this international credibility being in question, really, you have the chaotic withdrawal of Afghanistan. Let's not forget that was just a few weeks ago. He also is struggling to build some kind of international momentum to fight climate change, considering the rift and tension with China, and considering the fact that climate is such an important cornerstone of this year's United Nations General Assembly. Now it's really under, there's a question whether or not there is going to be some sort of climate agreement at the end of the General Assembly because of this rift. So that's something to take a look at. And also, you really see, you know, the rift with France, a traditional U.S. ally, that pouring into the European.
Senhor Presidente da Assembleia Geral, Abdullah Shahid, Senhor Secretário-Geral das Nações Unidas, Antônio Guterres, senhores chefes de Estado e de Governo e demais chefes de delegação, senhoras e senhores, é uma honra abrir novamente a Assembleia Geral das Nações Unidas. Venho aqui mostrar o Brasil diferente daquilo publicado em jornais ou visto em televisões. O Brasil mudou e muito depois que assumimos o governo em janeiro de 2019. Estamos há 2 anos e 8 meses sem qualquer caso concreto de corrupção. O Brasil tem um presidente que acredita em Deus, respeita a Constituição, valoriza a família e deve lealdade ao seu povo. Isso é muito. É uma sólida base se levarmos em conta que estávamos à beira do socialismo. Nossas estatais davam prejuízos de bilhões de dólares no passado. Hoje são lucrativas. Nosso Banco de Desenvolvimento era usado para financiar obras em países comunistas, sem garantias. Quem honrava esses compromissos era o próprio povo brasileiro. Tudo isso mudou. Apresento agora um novo Brasil, com sua credibilidade já recuperada diante do mundo. O Brasil possui o maior programa de país.
All of that has changed. I present to you now a new Brazil whose credibility has already been recovered in the world. Brazil currently has the largest investment partnership program with the private sector in its history, a program that is already in place and fully underway. been implemented. So far, $100 billion have been contracted in new investments, and $23 billion have been collected in concession projects granted. In the infrastructure sector, we auctioned 34 airports and 29 port terminals to the private sector. We already have more than $6 billion in private contracts for new railways. We have also introduced the railway permit system, which brings our model closer to the US model. In just a few days, we received 14 applications for permits for new railways, amounting to nearly $15 billion in private investments. Under our administration, we have promoted the revitalization of railway transportation. As a result, less consumption of fossil fuels and a lower level of operational costs for doing business in Brazil, especially translating in lower food production costs. Great progress has already been made in the field of basic sanitation. The largest auction in the sector's history took place in April, with concession projects granted to water distribution and sewage services in the state of Rio de Janeiro. We have everything investors look for: a large consumer market, excellent services and assets, a firm tradition of honoring and respecting contracts, and confidence in our administration. I also wish to announce that in the next few days we will be holding an auction for 5G technology deployment in Brazil. Our modern, sustainable, low-carbon agriculture currently feeds more than 1 billion people around the world, while taking up only 8% of our national territory. No other country in the world has such a comprehensive and thorough environmental legislation like ours. Our forest code sets an example for other countries to follow. Brazil is a country that is as vast as a continent with great environmental challenges. We are talking about 8.5 million square kilometers, of which 66%, two-thirds of the territory, are native vegetation. This